There are wounds that leave no scars on the skin, but carve deep into the heart and never fade for a lifetime. I know this because 20 years ago, right in the middle of a Thanksgiving dinner full of relatives, my husband slapped me across the face in front of everyone. But what made his face turn pale wasn't that slap. It was the next words spoken by my daughter, only 9 years old. Her words marked the beginning of a new life for us, and also became the sentence, "For all those who mistook my silence for weakness." Hello, everyone. My name is Margaret Hayes, and I just turned 60 this year. At this age, I should only be recalling the beautiful memories, spending time tending flowers in the garden and telling childhood stories to my grandchildren. But there are memories that, even after 20 years, remain etched in my heart like scars carved in stone. And I know that whenever I close my eyes, I can still see, hear, and feel that pain as clearly as if it happened yesterday. It was a Thanksgiving afternoon when I was just past 40. That small house of mine was lit up, the long dining table covered in a white cloth, candles flickering, and trays of hot dishes laid out ready. The smell of roast turkey and cinnamon filled the air, just like the perfect family scene someone out there might dream of. But the truth was far different. I knew well that behind that glittering facade were bruises hidden under long sleeves, the fear I kept swallowing down, and the lies I told myself. Just endure a little more, for the child. Harold, my husband, sat at the head of the table, posturing like a general. He loved to show off, pouring wine with a flourish, talking loudly, boasting about his work, his money, and the happy family with him at the center. My mother-in-law sat regally, eyes scanning for flaws to criticize. My sister-in-law pretended to be cordial, but every word out of her mouth was like a small blade, dripping with mockery and contempt. I was used to it. 20 years of marriage had taught me how to grit my teeth and smile, pour more wine, serve more dishes, and bow my head like the obedient wife. I thought if I endured just a little, the storm would pass. But that day, fate didn't allow me to stay silent. All because of one small remark. I remember adding a little detail to the story Harold was bragging about. Something utterly trivial. But in his eyes, it was disrespect. It was making him lose face in front of the family. Before I could even realize what was happening, Harold shot to his feet, raising his hand. The slap came down so fast and so hard that I staggered backward, one cheek burning, my eyes blurring. The sound, smack, echoed in the silent room like a gunshot. The plate in my hand crashed to the tile floor, shattering. I looked around. 12 pairs of eyes were all fixed on me. However, not a single person stood up. My mother-in-law curled her lips into a satisfied smile, as if justice had just been served. My sister-in-law chuckled, her eyes gleaming with glee. The rest lowered their gaze, pretending to focus on carving turkey or pouring wine, as though they hadn't seen anything. I stood there, my heart pounding in my chest, my hand trembling against my burning cheek. The humiliation didn't just come from Harold's hand, but from an entire room full of silent accomplices. I thought I would collapse right then and there. Then a voice rang out, small but so clear and firm it pierced through the silence. "Daddy, you shouldn't have done that." All eyes swiveled toward Amelia, my daughter, only 9 years old. She stood in the corner, clutching her worn doll to her chest. Her brown eyes just like mine in my youth, shone with a steady light that froze the entire room. Harold growled, "What did you just say?" Amelia swallowed hard, but her voice didn't tremble. I said, "Grandpa already knows, and he will come." The room seemed to hold its breath. I saw my mother-in-law turn pale, my sister-in-law stop laughing, and Harold freeze. His face drained of color, as if those words had struck the secret fear he had long tried to bury. I stood motionless, my cheek burning, my heart breaking, my head spinning. But my daughter's words echoed in my mind, loud and clear, like a warning bell. Now, at 60, I can tell you that was the moment that changed my entire life. Those innocent words, seemingly simple, became the spark that set everything ablaze, exposing the abuser's true face, forcing my in-laws to bow their heads, and leading my daughter and me out of the darkness. 20 years of living together. It sounds like a long journey filled with memories, but for me, it was a chain of days strung together by shouting, contemptuous looks, meals that stuck in my throat, and restless nights spent fearing the slam of a door in the middle of the night. When Harold was young, he was a man with charm. He spoke with confidence, knew how to flatter at the right moment, and knew how to promise sweet things. I, a woman in my 20s clinging to the dream of a peaceful home, believed I had chosen the right harbor. On our wedding day, I thought simply, as long as I worked hard and loved, the home would naturally become solid. But only a few years later, I realized that this home had no windows, only walls thick with invisible rules, and I was its most obedient prisoner. The greatest pain of my first 10 years of marriage was infertility. Each passing month was like a needle piercing my hope. I went to hospitals, took medicine, did acupuncture, prayed, only to be disappointed again. More than 10 years without a child turned me into a target for every accusation. My mother-in-law was bitter, never lowering her voice even when guests were present. A woman who sponges off others and can't even give birth. What good is she? My sister-in-law would sneer and jab, "Poor Harold. Other men have capable wives who help with work, and he ends up with a useless wife who's good for nothing." At every family gathering, I was like an extra chair. They spoke about other people's children, then turned to me with pitiful eyes. Once I hid in the bathroom, turning the faucet on high to mask my sobs. When I came out, I found my mother-in-law leaning against the doorframe, whispering just loud enough for me to hear. Even prayers are useless when God doesn't want to give. Harold rarely defended me. On the contrary, he turned my pain into an excuse to trample me. On drunken nights, with the stench of alcohol in my face, he would snarl, "People laugh at me behind my back. A wife who can't bear children is nothing but a scarecrow." I cried countless nights, burying my face in a pillow to muffle the sound. I once thought I would never be a mother. Then, by some grace, more than 10 years after our wedding, I became pregnant. When Amelia was born, I wept like rain, convinced that with a child everything would change. But I was wrong. Harold softened for a few months. Then everything went back, and worse because now he had a new reason. For the child's sake, you must stay silent. From then on, Harold controlled every dollar I touched. Grocery trips required receipts. Every cent had to be accounted for. An extra can of formula for the baby was a crime. At night, the living room turned into a courtroom. He sat with legs crossed like a judge. I stood stammering explanations, while my mother-in-law chimed in, feigning regret over my son's money. One evening, when I was missing a receipt, Harold dumped the entire bag onto the floor, loose change and crumpled slips scattering everywhere. I crouched down to gather them, my head so low I could see the dust beneath the table. Harold even controlled my dreams. I had submitted an application to a nursing program, hoping for a decent job, a modest salary to raise my child, and a sense of dignity. But right at the dinner table, in front of everyone, Harold pulled the form from his pocket, tore it in half, then into quarters, and threw it in the trash. "You think you're so capable? You couldn't even give birth quickly and you want to study. Stay home, cook, wash, and take care of me and the child. That's enough." I stood frozen, listening to the sound of paper falling like snowflakes, yet cold to the bone. My in-laws never stopped belittling me. I was branded a parasite, though I was the one waking early to cook, wash, clean, nurse a sick child, a shadow without pay or name. My mother-in-law would not forget to add bitterly, "So you had one child." big deal. At your age, chances of another are slim. Harold's misery will last a lifetime. There were days when the sound of the doorbell made my stomach twist, not from fear of visitors, but from fear of their prying eyes, as if this house held a shameful secret caused by me. I remember once at church, Mrs. Evelyn clutched the pastor's hand, her voice dripping sweetness as she spoke of her incompetent daughter-in-law, while I stood beside her, frozen like a statue. "I'm right here," I wanted to say. "I hear every word." But my throat locked shut. At home, I learned to walk softly, speak gently, and smile stiffly. I learned to read Harold's footsteps on the stairs to guess his mood. Heavy steps meant a storm. Light ones meant temporary calm. I learned to align forks and knives perfectly to avoid being called clumsy. I learned to keep silent when humiliated in front of guests because I knew talking back only made the door slam louder behind me and his hand strike faster. Many nights, Amelia clutched her teddy bear and whispered, "Mom, why do you cry so often?" I wiped my tears and stroked her hair. "It's nothing, honey. Mommy's just a little tired, but children are not as naive as adults think." She saw me shrink when Harold entered a room. She saw me wear long sleeves in the heat to hide bruises. She saw me bite my lip when scolded, eyes glued to the floor tiles. Amelia understood everything, and she grew quieter, older than her years. She spoke softly, avoided dropping spoons, and avoided making noise, as if she, too, was learning to survive in the same mental prison as her mother. I began to grow numb. Every dream of mine was shoved into a small box hidden on top of the cupboard. Inside lay the wrinkled nursing brochure, a fountain pen long dried out, and a photograph of me at 20, smiling brightly. Sometimes I would open the box, hold the brochure, read a few lines, then put it back, like an addict trying to quit, knowing relapse would come with just one whiff of paper. I also practiced deceiving myself. I told myself, "He's just hot-tempered. He'll get better." For the child, but each time I whispered that, I felt myself shrink a little more, like a shadow retreating at sunset. I laughed less, spoke less, and even slept less, dozing only until the sound of his car outside jolted me awake like a sparrow caught in a storm. I once thought that silence was how I kept a home for my child, but now, at 60, looking back, I both pity and blame myself. My endurance only taught my daughter what fear looked like. I wanted to protect her, but instead I planted cracks in her childhood, cracks no one could see, but whenever the wind shifted, they ached. There is one thing that, even now at 60, still fills me with both tenderness and pain when I remember it. Children sometimes see everything. It's just that we adults try to pretend they don't know. That year, Amelia had just turned 9. She still went to school, still had dolls, still spent afternoons scribbling flowers, but her eyes had changed. They were no longer the clear, carefree eyes of other children her age. Every time Harold raised his voice, every time I jumped at the slam of a door, I knew Amelia was taking it all in. I always tried to soothe her with the same familiar lies. "Daddy's just a little hot-tempered, sweetheart. Adults argue sometimes, but it'll pass." But Amelia didn't believe it anymore. Once she looked straight into my eyes, her brown eyes glowing with a strange sadness, and whispered, "That's not true, Mom. I see Dad make you cry. I see you holding your shoulders and arms. It hurts a lot. I'm scared." My heart felt like it was being squeezed. I hurriedly changed the subject to her homework, but I knew she was no longer plugging her ears the way I wished. It was during that time that Amelia did something I only learned about many years later. She decided to write a letter to her grandfather, my father, James Mitchell, a retired colonel. He was someone Amelia loved dearly. She would often sit and listen to him tell stories of his time in the Army, about discipline, courage, and especially fairness. In Amelia's eyes, her grandfather was the embodiment of strength and protection. One afternoon, while I was busy in the kitchen, Amelia sat in her room, opened her school notebook, and began to write. The letter was short, but every word was like a knife. "Grandpa, it's me, Amelia. I'm not sure if I should write this letter, but I'm terrified. Dad often makes Mom cry. Dad hits Mom. Sometimes Mom holds her shoulders and arms. It hurts a lot. Mom says Dad is just hot-tempered, but I don't believe it. I don't want Mom to cry anymore. I don't want to be at home, always afraid. And can you help me?" Amelia folded the letter, slipped it into an envelope, and hid it in her school bag. The next day, on the way to school, she secretly asked a friend to drop it at the small post office nearby. That letter left her hands, quietly starting its fateful journey, the journey that would change both our lives. I had no idea. Back then, I only saw Amelia writing often, thinking she was keeping a diary or doing a school assignment. I even smiled to myself, thinking, my child is so good, so diligent with her writing. I had no clue she was writing an indictment to her own grandfather. As I sit here telling this now, I still remember how it felt when I learned about it years later. I was torn between pain, pride, and sorrow for my 9-year-old daughter, who had to shoulder a fear greater than that of an adult. In my memory, those days were a loop. Harold angry, me silent, my in-laws chiming in with scorn. But in Amelia's memory, those were the days she was gathering her resolve to seek help. Her letter was a cry for rescue, a plea for protection. My father, Colonel James, received that letter. I only know because later he told me that when he opened the envelope, he sat in silence for a long time. A man who had been through the battlefield, who had seen countless scenes of tragedy, said he had never felt pain like that. Pain at knowing his own daughter was being abused. Even deeper pain knowing that his little granddaughter had to be the one to speak up for her mother. Back then I had no idea. I still trudged on, telling myself I endured it for my child. I didn't know that small letter had become the spark, and that my father had begun to watch, preparing for the storm that would sweep Harold and all his enablers away. Now, at 60, I can finally admit a bitter truth. Without that letter, I might never have had the courage to leave that endless darkness. I didn't save myself, but my daughter saved us both. After my father received Amelia's letter, he never knew another moment of peace. As a retired colonel who had lived through war, he knew what loss was, but he had never imagined that the daughter he had raised with a lifetime of discipline and love had been silently enduring such torment. He told me that when he opened the letter, the pain in his chest was so sharp he had to brace himself against the table. Reading the uneven handwriting of his 9-year-old granddaughter felt like knives carving into his heart. But instead of immediately raising an uproar, my father chose the way he had learned in the military: observe, collect, wait for the right moment. I had no idea at the time. I only recall occasionally glancing out the window and seeing the familiar figure of a silver-haired man standing on the sidewalk, far away, turning quietly to leave. I never suspected it was my father. He had come, but he did not step inside. My father began secretly coming to the house. He never rang the bell, never announced himself. He would stand outside the fence or sit in his car, writing in his notebook. He saw everything. He saw Harold shouting furiously because dinner was a few minutes late. He saw me bow my head, clutching the dish towel with both hands as if it were an invisible shield. He saw Amelia clutch her books and hurry upstairs, her small shoulders curling in fear of the storm about to break. Every detail he recorded carefully. The day, the hour, the behavior, the words. A battle-hardened officer now facing a family war, he kept the same meticulous habits as if writing a report. In that notebook, each line became evidence against Harold. He did more than write. Quietly, he spoke with neighbors, asking subtle questions about the arguments they'd overheard, the sound of things breaking. One elderly neighbor whispered, "I've heard it more than once, Mr. James." but we were afraid to interfere in someone else's family business. My father simply nodded, never blaming, only adding to his notes. There was one time he saw it with his own eyes. Harold smashing a cup onto the floor right in front of me, shards scattering everywhere. I remember it clearly. I knelt picking up each piece of glass with trembling hands, biting my lip to hold back tears. My father stood outside the window, his fists clenched so tightly, his knuckles turned white. Later, he told me that moment nearly broke his restraint, that he wanted nothing more than to burst in and drag me out immediately, but he held back because he knew. To defeat an abuser, you cannot rely on rage alone. You must rely on evidence and the law. All I knew was that during those months, my father grew quieter. Every phone call, his voice was slow, measured, controlled. I thought he was aging, his health declining, and I didn't think much of it. I had no idea that in his eyes there already gleamed a light like steel, the light of a storm gathering strength. Looking back, I shudder. Back then, I was like someone stumbling in the dark, unaware that somewhere behind me, a man was quietly following with a flashlight. I didn't understand why my father suddenly appeared at that Thanksgiving dinner. All I saw was him entering like a stern judge. Only later did I piece it together. Amelia's trembling letter, his silent months of observation and note-taking, those were the foundations for the confrontation that was inevitable. Now, at 60, as I write these lines, I know my father chose silence with courage. He didn't rush in to make a scene, didn't yell the way Harold did. He was silent like a soldier in ambush, waiting for the precise moment to strike. And when that moment came, Harold and my in-laws were left with no escape. Back then, I was naive, clueless. All I saw was my father's eyes shining like steel. I didn't understand that a storm was already gathering. Right outside the home, I thought I would be imprisoned in forever. Whenever I look back, that Thanksgiving when Amelia was 9 always feels like a stage play. Every member of Harold's family played their role to perfection. The mocker, the sneerer, the pretender. And me, I was nothing but a puppet on that stage, silent, enduring, and bowing my head. But that day, one slap ripped apart the fake performance, and one small voice shook it all to its core. Harold's family arrived early in full force. My mother-in-law, Evelyn, was the first to step inside. The moment she crossed the threshold, her eyes swept across the living room like an inspector checking for flaws. Her gaze landed on the curtains, then on my clothes, and finally on my face. A bitter smile appeared. Not bad. At least this year, the house doesn't look too messy. My sister-in-law, Miranda, hugged me with feigned affection, then whispered right into my ear, "You've aged so much. That's what happens to women who live in misery." I bit my lip and said nothing. Each word was a knife, but I was far too used to them. The others quickly joined in. Kevin, my brother-in-law, slapped Harold on the shoulder and laughed loudly. "You've got guts. Living with a wife who only knows her way around the kitchen and still putting up with it for all these years. I admire you." The whole table burst into raucous laughter. I sat there forcing a stiff smile, my fingers fiddling with the napkin in my lap. Harold, as always, basked in being the center of attention. Sitting at the head of the table, he raised his wine glass and began boasting about his successes. He talked about his work, the big contracts, and the many sacrifices he had made for the family. Each bragging line was met with nods of approval from his relatives. I listened, embarrassed and suffocated. Then, out of habit, out of some instinct to ease the atmosphere, I made the mistake of speaking up. Just one small sentence. "Yes, that night you came home very late, and it was pouring rain, too." I only meant to add a detail to make Harold's story more vivid, a small, harmless remark. But the next moment, I realized I had violated a forbidden rule. Harold's face darkened. His eyes flashed with fury. To him, my words weren't a harmless comment. They were interrupting, disrespectful, an insult in front of his family. He slammed his hand on the table, making the wine glass tremble. The room fell into dead silence. "Shut your mouth," Harold snarled. "Who gave you permission to interrupt me while I'm talking? In front of everyone, you dare humiliate me?" Before I could react, his hand swung. The slap struck so hard my whole body reeled, my cheek burning. The silver spoon in my hand clattered onto the tiled floor. The entire room froze. Evelyn leaned back in her chair, a satisfied smirk curling on her lips. Miranda giggled. The others quickly dropped their eyes, pretending to be absorbed in their plates. Not one person stood up. Blood pounded in my temples. My heart raced. My hands trembled. The humiliation seeped into my very skin. But before I could collapse, a clear voice rang out. "Daddy shouldn't do that!" Every head turned. Amelia stood in the corner of the room, clutching her worn doll. Her brown eyes blazed, far more resolute than her 9 years. Harold growled, "What did you just say?" Amelia lifted her chin, her voice steady, without fear, without tears. "Grandpa knows he's coming." The room seemed to stop breathing. Evelyn's face drained of color. Miranda's mouth fell open. Kevin stammered, "James, she means her grandfather?" Harold stiffened. I saw him swallow hard, his hand still trembling. He strode toward Amelia, growling like a cornered beast. "You dare make up lies to turn me against your own father?" Panicked, I rushed forward to shield my daughter. But before I could reach her, the door burst open, sharp, final, resounding. Everyone flinched, and then, to the stunned eyes of Harold's entire family, my father, James Mitchell, stepped inside. He stood in the doorway, his silver hair gleaming under the light, his posture still as straight as in his military days. His eyes swept across the room, the red handprint burning on my cheek, Harold's menacing stance, the guilty faces at the table. He didn't need to shout. He didn't need to threaten. That gaze alone made Harold falter, stumbling back a step. I knew then. The storm my father had been silently preparing had finally broken into this house, and this time, it wouldn't sweep me away. The door burst open and my father, James Mitchell, stepped inside. But he did not come alone. Behind him were 2 local police officers, their uniforms crisp, their expressions stern. The air in the room froze. The mocking laughter from moments earlier vanished, as if it had never existed. Evelyn, my mother-in-law, gaped. Miranda stood in shock, and Harold stiffened as though he'd just been caught in the act. My father didn't speak right away. His eyes swept across the table, pausing at the red handprint burning on my cheek, then shifting to Amelia, still standing beside me, her brown eyes steady and fearless. Finally, his gaze landed on Harold. It was sharp as steel, cold as a blade. "Father-in-law," Harold stammered, his voice trembling. "Why are you—" My father's voice was low, firm, unshakable. "Sit down." The words weren't loud, but the authority in them made Harold swallow hard and instinctively step back. The officers advanced. One of them nodded to me and Amelia, then spoke clearly. "We are here at the request of Colonel James Mitchell. We have a report of domestic violence at this address." The room erupted. Evelyn shot up from her chair, her voice shrill. "Report? This is my son's home. He's a wonderful husband and a devoted father. You have no right to insult my family like this." My father turned, his eyes blazing. "Sit down!" His voice cracked like a gunshot. Evelyn froze. My father stepped forward, pointing straight at her. "You knew. You sat there, watched, and even encouraged. You are complicit. Don't pretend you're innocent." Evelyn's face went pale, and no words came out. Miranda, too, fell silent, her mocking smile gone. The officers continued. "We have evidence from the child's letter, testimony from neighbors, and reports from the school. The victim has endured long enough. Now is the time to act. Harold stammered, trying to reclaim his usual swagger. This is all just a misunderstanding. I never... Another officer cut him off, voice icy. The mark of your hand is still fresh on your wife's face. We don't need further evidence tonight. My father stepped closer, placing himself between Amelia and me and Harold. His voice was slow, but each word struck like iron. 3 years. For 3 years you've raised your hand against my daughter. For 3 years you've filled my granddaughter's life with fear. You thought you could keep hiding behind the mask of a successful man? Tonight, that mask falls. Harold's eyes darted around, searching for support, but this time no one shielded him. Miranda dropped her gaze. Kevin, Harold's younger brother, let out a sigh, then spoke softly, loud enough for all to hear. I used to think you were just hot-tempered, but now I see you for what you are, a coward. Harold's eyes bulged. Kevin, how dare you? Shut up, Kevin barked, his voice shaking with rage. You've shamed us. You've dragged this whole family into disgrace. I had never seen Harold so pale. The man who once strutted with pride, who called himself the pillar of the household, now trembled under the contempt of his own siblings. Evelyn tried one last time. My son is just a little short-tempered. Every man has his moments. My father cut her off, his voice like thunder. Short temper is no excuse to strike a wife. Short temper is no reason to terrorize a child. If a short temper lasts 3 years, that's not temper, that's abuse. Evelyn collapsed back into her chair, speechless. The officers stepped forward. One pulled handcuffs from his belt, his voice flat and cold. Harold Whitman, you are under arrest for domestic violence. You have the right to remain silent. No! Harold roared, his eyes bloodshot. I'm not going anywhere. This is my house. But no one answered him. The officers locked his arms behind his back. The metallic click of the cuffs echoed through the room. Harold thrashed, but it was useless. I stood there, clutching Amelia tightly, watching the man who had tormented me being led out of the house. My heart pounded wildly, trembling yet relieved. That feeling I will never forget. For the first time, Harold was the one being taken away in front of everyone, while I stood tall, my head lifted. Kevin shook his head and murmured, "He brought this on himself." Miranda bit her lip, tears brimming, but she didn't dare speak. Evelyn sat pale-faced, her fingers digging into the chair, her eyes vacant. My father turned to me, his voice softening. "Daughter, from now on you will never have to endure this again." I broke into sobs, my shoulders shaking. Amelia lifted her eyes to her grandfather, her gaze shining with unshakable trust. She had been right. Grandpa knew, and he had come. When the door closed behind Harold, the room remained silent for a long time. I could hear my own breath, my racing heartbeat, and in that moment, I knew my life had taken a new turn. That night, I stepped out of the invisible prison I had believed would confine me forever. And it all began with the trembling letter of a 9-year-old child, a letter that became evidence, a letter that lit the fire that led my father to free us. After that fateful night, everything in my life changed. Harold was led away in handcuffs under the stunned stares of his entire family. For the first time in years, Amelia and I stood in that house without trembling in fear. But I knew we couldn't stay. That house was nothing but a prison, its walls still echoing with shouts and the hidden tears I had shed. My father, Colonel James, held Amelia and me tightly, then said firmly, "Pack your things. From now on, you'll live with me." I nodded without hesitation. Over the next few days, I gathered only the essentials, a few sets of clothes, some of Amelia's books, and a small framed photo of my late mother. That was all. 20 years of marriage, reduced to a handful of suitcases. I looked at the house one last time, feeling both pain and relief. Pain, because 20 years of my life had been crushed within those walls. Relief, because I was finally walking out. In those first days living with my father, I felt like a bird newly freed from its cage. I wasn't used to the silence of mornings, silence not born of fear, but of peace. I wasn't used to eating dinner without the constant dread of Harold erupting over a dish too salty or too bland. I wasn't used to sitting beside my daughter, listening to her laughter without it being instantly drowned out by her father's voice. My father cared for us as if trying to make up for all the years we had lost. He picked Amelia up from school and taught her small lessons about discipline and courage. I remember once, Amelia sat in his lap and asked, "Grandpa, if I hadn't written you that letter, what would have happened to Mom and me?" My father was silent for a moment, then stroked her hair. "You saved your mother." One little letter, but it was an act of courage. Never think you're too small to make a difference. Hearing that, I wept and smiled at the same time. It was true. My daughter had saved us both from the darkness. As for me, I knew it was time to do what Harold had always forbidden. I dug out my old documents and, with my father's help, applied to a nursing program. The day I held the acceptance letter in my hands, it trembled, my heart racing like that of an 18-year-old girl. I had thought that dream was buried forever under layers of humiliation, but it had been waiting for me all along. Balancing school with caring for Amelia wasn't easy. There were times when I was exhausted and times when I thought of giving up. But every time I looked at my daughter working on her homework, her eyes serious and determined, I reminded myself I cannot collapse. She needs to see me rise. Amelia changed, too. From the quiet child who used to shrink in corners, she grew bright and joyful. She joined the school's drama club, made friends, and filled the air with the kind of laughter I had rarely heard before. Sometimes I caught her watching me closely, then smiling softly. I knew she understood. Her small letter had opened a new life for us both. Now, at 60, when I look back, I see that Amelia and I started from zero then. No money, no property, no house of our own. But it was a zero of freedom, a new beginning without the chains of abuse, without the weight of insults. We could finally live as ourselves. And I learned something vital. Sometimes a trembling letter written in a child's uneven hand is enough to light up the darkness. Sometimes strength doesn't come from a man's fists, but from a child's courage. We stepped into the light that day, and from then on, we never returned to the shadows. 20 years, long enough for a timid young woman to become someone seasoned by life. Long enough for a trembling child clutching a doll to become a strong, fearless woman, standing in court defending the vulnerable, and long enough for those who once strutted, believing themselves untouchable, to taste the full weight of their own consequences. Now, at 60, my hair more silver than black, I sit by the window, the small garden outside, awash in morning sunlight, and I ask myself, if Amelia hadn't written that letter, would I be sitting here today? I know the answer. Number. I would have withered away long ago. After leaving Harold, I started over from nothing. The path wasn't easy. I was a single mother, returning to school while working part-time to support myself. But I persevered. Nights spent awake over textbooks, mornings rushing to class after dropping Amelia off at school. All of it forged a strength I never knew I had. I graduated with the nursing degree Harold had once torn up in my face, and I didn't stop there. I kept studying and gradually became head nurse in a large hospital. From a woman once called a parasite, I became a pillar for patients who were weak and afraid. Every time I looked into their eyes, I remembered myself in those days of humiliation and silently vowed never to let anyone suffer in silence if I could help it. And Amelia, the 9-year-old child of that dark time, is now a sharp, determined attorney. She chose to specialize in defending women and children who've endured abuse. In every case she takes, every client she stands for, I see echoes of us. The women who thought they'd lost their voices, the children who thought trembling in silence was their only option. Amelia once said to me, "I'm not just a lawyer, I'm paying back the debt of what you and I endured." When I see her in a tailored suit in court, I feel pride and a lump in my throat. My daughter has turned the trembling letter of her childhood into a lifelong mission. And Harold? The man who once puffed out his chest and called himself the pillar of the family, who boasted at dinner tables, lost everything. After prison, his career vanished. Friends turned their backs on him, and even his family distanced themselves. In the years that followed, he lived quietly in a small town, moving through life like a shadow. A few times he sent letters to Amelia, asking for forgiveness, for a chance to see her again. But my daughter only shook her head. He had his chance, and he lost it forever. It wasn't cruelty, it was justice. Evelyn, my mother-in-law, the woman who once strutted, looking down on me with contempt, ended her life in a nursing home, alone. No visitors. Miranda, my sister-in-law, fared no better. After years of chasing frivolous pleasures, her friends abandoned her. No one wanted to be involved with her anymore. In the end, both of them tasted what they had once served me, loneliness and coldness. When I think of them now, I no longer feel anger. Instead, my heart is calm. I understand now that everyone pays for what they do, sooner or later. Today, as I sit here writing my story, it feels as though I've lived another lifetime. I began from zero, but it was a zero of freedom. From darkness, I stepped into the light, and it all began with a small letter, written in the shaky hand of a 9-year-old child. Without that letter, I might have withered away in a house full of shouting. But that letter became a sentence of justice, and a lamp lighting the path that led us into a different life.